On November the 1st, 1939, which was a Wednesday, Chinese forces launched the winter offensive on multiple fronts against the Imperial Japanese Army. A royal decree in the Netherlands established martial law in key regions, mostly along the German-Dutch border. So, at least in principle, the Netherlands wanted to prepare itself for the possibility of a German invasion. On Thursday, November the 2nd, 1939, the Polish government in exile dissolved the parliament and established a national council to govern in its place. On Friday, November the 3rd, 1939, pursuant to President Franklin Roosevelt's proposal, the US Congress changed or amended the Neutrality Act of 1937, repealing the embargo on arms to belligerents but placing sales on a cash and carry basis to avoid a repeat of the situation after the First World War, when Britain and France ran into difficulty with making their war debt payments to the United States. The German-controlled American freighter City of Flint entered the town of Port of Haugesund in Norway, despite being ordered by its Norwegian escort, the mine layer Olav Tryggvason, not to. The Germans were interned for violating international law, which forbade a ship from entering a neutral port without sufficient cause. On Saturday, November the 4th, 1939, the American neutrality law came into force, forbidding American ships and citizens from entering clearly defined war zones. The City of Flint sailed to Bergen, a port city in western or southwestern Norway, with US control finally restored. On Sunday, November the 5th, 1939, three German army commanders, Fedor von Bock, Wilhelm Ritter von Leeb, and Gerd von Rundstedt, who believed an invasion of France would fail, held a secret meeting to discuss ways to dissuade Hitler from ordering an attack on the Western Front. On Monday, November the 6th, 1939, in Sonderaktion Krakow, or Separate Action Krakow, a large city in southern Poland, 183 professors of Jagiellonian University in Krakow were arrested by the Nazis. 168 of them were sent to the Sachsenhausen concentration camp, and I would assume that at least many, if not most of them, died there. And if I remember correctly from a French language biography of the late Pope John Paul II, at least two of those professors were his personal friends, or at least two of them were named. On Tuesday, November the 7th, 1939, Queen Wilhelmina of the Netherlands and King Leopold III, or Leopold III, of the Belgians offered to mediate in the European war. The Polish government in exile made Władysław Sikorski General Inspector of the Armed Forces. On Wednesday, November the 8th, 1939, occurred another attempt on Hitler's life. 13 minutes after he had ended his speech at the Bürgerbräu Keller in Munich, Bavaria, on the 16th anniversary of the beer hall putsch, a time bomb exploded near the speaking platform that killed 8 people. Carpenter Johann Georg Elser was arrested with incriminating documents at the Swiss border and brought back to Munich for interrogation. His attempt to assassinate Hitler would have succeeded if the Führer's annual speech had not begun 30 minutes earlier than it did in previous years. And if I remember correctly from that British-produced Chronicle of the Second World War, Hitler exclaimed enthusiastically, "Providence intends me to reach my goal." And then what happened to Mr. Elser? He was executed at the Dachau concentration camp, tragically less than a month before the Nazi German army surrendered on April the 9th, 1945. On Thursday, November the 9th, 1939, Supreme Allied Commander, the Frenchman Maurice Gamelin, or Gamelin, received his dial plan at a conference of senior Allied officers in Vincennes. On Friday, November the 10th, 1939, Hitler flew for the first time in his new personal transport plane, an FW-200A-0 named Immelmann, the third after the First World War flying ace Max Immelmann. On Saturday, November the 11th, 1939, Hitler appeared unexpectedly in Munich at the funeral for the victims of the Bürgerbräu-Keller bombing. He stayed only a few minutes to hear his deputy, Rudolf Hess, deliver the eulogy and then left without speaking. The Nazis burned down the Ezra's Israel synagogue in Łódź, Poland. Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Consort of King George VI of Britain, made a broadcast to the women of the British Empire reminding them that in the war, we, no less than men, have real and vital work to do. On Sunday, November the 12th, 1939, German authorities started to deport Jews from Polish territories annexed by Germany to the general government. France said that the Belgian and Dutch offer of mediation required Germany to repair the injustices which force has imposed on Austria, Czechoslovakia and Poland before peace could be discussed. The British King George VI wrote a reply explaining that the essential conditions upon which we are determined that an honourable peace must be secured have already been plainly stated. But if the Queen of the Netherlands was able to communicate to me any proposals from Germany of such a character as to afford real prospect of achieving Britain's aims, he would give them my most earnest consideration. On the same day died in China Norman Bethune, a Canadian physician and humanitarian, aged 49. He had been born in Gravenhurst, Ontario, in March 1890. He had joined the Communist Party. He had received his medical doctorate in 1916, having joined the Canadian Army's No. 2 Field Ambulance to serve as a stretcher bearer in France, having been wounded by shrapnel and spending 3 months recovering in a British hospital. After recovering from his injuries, he had returned to Toronto to complete his medical degree. He became increasingly concerned with the disease's socio-economic aspects. As a concerned doctor in Montreal during the 1930s economic depression, he frequently sought out the poor and gave them free medical care. He was an early proponent of socialized medicine, in other words, a government-run and funded comprehensive health insurance, national health insurance, or in Canada, federal health insurance, and formed the Montreal Group for the Security of People's Health. In 1936, he traveled to the Soviet Union to observe firsthand their healthcare system, and during that year he became a committed communist, joining the Canadian Communist Party. When returning from the Spanish Civil War to raise support for the Loyalist cause, he openly identified with the Communist cause. In January 1938, Bethune traveled to Yan'an in the Shanbei region of Shanxi province in China. There he joined the Chinese communists led by Mao Zedong, the country's later communist dictator. In China, he performed emergency battlefield surgical operations on war casualties and established training for doctors, nurses, and orderlies. He did not distinguish between casualties. In the summer of 1939, he was appointed medical advisor to the Jincha-ji or Shanxi Chahar Hebei border region military district under the direction of General Ni Rongzhen. Stationed with the Communist Party of China's 8th Route Army in the midst of the Second Chinese-Japanese War, Bethune cut his finger while operating on a soldier. Probably due to his weakened state, he contracted septicemia or blood poisoning and sadly died of his wounds on November the 12th, 1939. Then, on Monday, November the 13th, 1939, British soil was bombed by the Germans for the first time in the Shetland Islands. No casualties were inflicted. The Finnish delegation in Moscow, having refused the Soviet demands, left the Soviet capital. HMS Blanche was sunk by a mine in the Thames estuary, the first British destroyer lost to enemy action in the war. On Tuesday, November the 14th, 1939, Joachim von Ribbentrop informed the Belgian and Dutch envoys that Germany was turning down their joint mediation offer based on the responses already made from Britain and France. The Great Synagogue of Łódź in Poland was burned to the ground by the Nazis. On Wednesday, November the 15th, 1939, the Battle of South Guanji began. The German heavy cruiser Deutschland was named Lützow, both to confuse enemy intelligence and to avoid the potential damage to national pride that would occur if a ship bearing the country's name were to be sunk in action. A funeral held in Prague for Czechoslovak or Czech patriot Jan Opletal turned into another spontaneous anti-Nazi demonstration. On November the 17th, 1939, which was a Friday, Germans stormed the university dorms in Prague and other towns in the former Czechoslovakia, attacking and arresting thousands of students. Today, International Students' Day is observed on November the 17th in remembrance of the students who were killed or sent to concentration camps for opposing the Nazis. On Saturday, November the 18th, 1939, the Dutch liner Simon Bolivar set off 2 mines and sank 20 miles, or about 32 kilometers, off Harwich, England. 86 lives were lost out of the approximately 400 on board. The Nazis closed all the technical schools in the former Czechoslovakia. On Sunday, November the 19th, 1939, an official German communiqué announced that barricades had been erected around the Warsaw Ghetto and that Jewish districts would be placed under strict control. On Monday, November the 20th, 1939, Britain had its first submarine success of the war when HMS Sturgeon sank the German patrol vessel D-209 in the Heligoland Bight. All Jewish assets held in banks in the general government were blocked. On Tuesday, November the 21st, 1939, the British government declared a blockade of German exports in reprisal for numerous incidents at sea, such as the sinking of the Athenia and the Simon Bolivar. The British destroyer HMS Gypsy struck a mine outside Harwich and sank with the loss of 30 crew. Antanas Merkis became the Prime Minister of Lithuania, but the country remained nominally firmly under the control of the dictatorial president or autocratic president Antanas Smetona. However, the Soviet Union held supreme control because it had stationed thousands of its soldiers in the naval and other military bases of Lithuania. On Wednesday, November the 22nd, 1939, the Polish government in exile moved from Paris to Angers. On Thursday, November the 23rd, 1939, German authorities ordered all Jews over the age of 10 residing in the general government to wear white armbands bearing a Star of David. The British armed merchant cruiser HMS Rawalpindi was sunk by German warships north of the Faroe Islands. 238 of 286 crew were lost. The Official Secrets Act 1939 received royal assent in the United Kingdom, revising the Act of 1920. On Friday, November the 24th, 1939, the Japanese 5th Division captured Nanning in China. On Saturday, November the 25th, 1939, International Olympic Committee President Henri de Baillet-Latour announced the cancellation of the 1940 Winter Olympics, which would have been held in Garmisch-Partenkirchen, Germany. On Sunday, November the 26th, 1939, happened the so-called shelling of Mainila. The Soviet Union ordered a few of its soldiers to fire several shots on the Soviet territory, at least one or two of them actually from a point inside the Soviet territory, but because of the border's winding nature, it was to the northeast of Mainila, if I remember correctly, Soviet village, northeast or northwest of Mainila, and so it appeared in Mainila as if those shots had been fired across the Finnish territory or from Finland. Supposedly 4 Soviet soldiers were wounded and 4 Soviet soldiers were killed and 9 wounded. I'm going to see the figures. But 3 Finnish observation posts had border guards, and they detected the fall of 7 shots. These witnesses estimated that the shells detonated approximately 800 meters inside the Soviet territory, and that they made shell holes on that treeless field, and then some Soviet soldiers came there to look at them for a while and then withdrew. Anyway, yeah, it was impossible physically for the Finnish guns to reach Mainila because in order to prevent even accidental firing of shots into the Soviet territory, the Finnish armed forces chief officers such as General and Marshal Mannerheim had already ordered the Finnish artillery to be withdrawn so far from the border that their range simply would not carry any cannonballs or shells over the Soviet-Finnish border. And this was a false flag operation designed to somehow justify the impending Soviet attack on Finland. On Monday, November the 27th, 1939, Finland denied shelling Mainila and suggested that the Soviets had accidentally fired upon their own village in connection with training exercises. On Tuesday, November the 28th, 1939, 12 Bristol Blenheims of the Royal Air Force of Britain conducted a bombing raid on the German seaplane base at Borkum. Little damage was done. The Soviet Union cancelled the Soviet-Finnish Non-Aggression Pact from 1932. Then on Wednesday, November the 29th, 1939, the German submarine U-35 surfaced and surrendered near the Shetland Islands after being disabled by depth charges from the British destroyers HMS Icarus, Kashmir and Kingston. A decree of the Presidium of the Supreme Soviet granted all permanent residents of Soviet-occupied Poland full citizenship of the USSR. But if they were of military age, men, they had to serve in the Red Army. And then on November the 29th, 1939, the Soviet Union also broke off its diplomatic relations with Finland. On Thursday, November the 30th, 1939, the Soviet Union invaded Finland. Initially, some 600,000 soldiers of the Red Army were stationed on the front, and the Finnish army, even with its reserves, had under 350,000 soldiers. The Battle of Petsamo began. The Soviet aircraft bombed Helsinki and various other Finnish cities.